but I do remember driving up the grade and seeing the Joshua trees and being just like, wow, this is like alien. What is this place?
Welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 145. Find out more about the podcast at desertladydiaries.com and engage with the guests, other listeners, or me on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries. It was a pretty windy desert day when Cindy and I had our conversation, and Zoom isn't a fan of wind, so there are a few glitches in the audio, but I would say a good 98% is perfectly clear. And I will address the fact that you're only hearing this intro in one ear in the outro of this podcast.
Cindy Daigneault was born and raised in Minnesota. Soon after completing broadcasting school, Cindy escaped those bitter Minnesota winters, heading to California for a job at a Ventura area radio station where she would meet her husband. A chance radio consulting request brought Cindy and her young family to 29 Palms. They eventually applied for and received a license to build and operate the Morongo Basin radio station Kcdz, also known as Z1077 FM. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Dawn, for having me.
Sure. So tell me what your first experience with desert was. Any desert, doesn't necessarily have to be this desert, any desert.
Well, being from Minnesota, my first experience with any desert was this desert. Okay.
And how did that come about?
Well, having moved from the snowy Minnesota and Wisconsin winters, because I did live in Wisconsin for a year also, I wanted to come to California. So I moved to the beach. Also, that was a headhunter, I guess you would say, who brought me to California. Met my husband shortly thereafter, about 8 months thereafter. We ended up getting married just a few months after that. And we had the same headhunter approached me and said, hey, I have somebody out in Joshua Tree that is looking for a young salesperson to start their radio sales team. And I was like, okay, where's Joshua Tree? What's a Joshua Tree? What's a desert? I mean, honestly, I thought I was looking at something like I'd seen in the Roadrunner Coyote cartoons.
Right.
That's what I expected the desert to be. So we actually drove out here to Joshua Tree. And at the time, there was an AM FM radio station out here. It was called Katy High and KQYN, K Queen Radio. And it was a couple that owned that station. They interviewed me and interviewed my husband too then. And we decided, what do we got to lose? Let's move to the desert. We'd only been married for, 3 months when we moved here. So we were newlyweds. I was barely drinking age when I moved to the desert.
Oh my goodness. So I want to back up a little bit to your move from the Midwest to California. So you had a headhunter looking for, was it radio jobs? Were you on air, or were you always interested in the sales end of the business?
Actually, I went to broadcasting school at Brown Institute, which went out of business a few years back. And I wanted to be a DJ. And that was always my dream. So I was a DJ, but I found out really fast that the people who make the money are the people in sales. And so I happened to go to work for a place that did every DJ also had to have a sales list. So I worked actually from 8 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night in my first radio job. I did sales from 8 to 5, and then I was on air from 6 to 10.
Oh my goodness. You know what? You just reminded me of something that I did when I lived in New Jersey. It was the first station that I was ever on. And it was a little small station in central New Jersey. And how they posed it was, we'll give you airtime if you pay for it. So when I came in to talk to the guy about it, I'm like, well, what do you mean you'll give me airtime if I pay for it? He goes, well, you just have to go out and find people to sponsor your show.
Oh, that's interesting.
So isn't that interesting? Yeah. So you just reminded me of going way back there. WCNJ. I don't think they're in business anymore.
That's a very old concept. And
oh my gosh.
I know that. But no, I was actually hired out of broadcasting school. The gentleman had just bought this radio station in Wisconsin, and he was looking for 5 people to come work for him. So he came to the school and he said, give me 5 of your recommendations. And of course, I was the only female. I mean, it was a very male dominated business because we're talking the late 70s here. The school I went to, there was 500 and some students and only 35 were women. So I was really in a minority and felt like I was kind of, starting to break that glass ceiling. But I did go with 4 other people. We went to Wisconsin, moved there, never had been to this area before. And I worked there for about a year and kind of got homesick. So I went back to Minnesota. And after a few months, I was like, oh no, we had 60 days straight of sub-zero weather. And I had to plug my car in at night in the garage. So with the block heater so that it would start. And it was just one morning I went out to start my car and it wouldn't start. And I couldn't get to work and I was crying and I was like, I can't do this. I can't handle this winter weather anymore. So the person that I had gone to another sales school with all of the staff of this little Wisconsin radio station and had met the consultant who ran it. And I called him and said, hey, Jim, I have got to get out of the Midwest. Can you find me something? And within a couple of days, he had found 3 different offers. And the one in California is the one I took because I wanted to be someplace warm. And I wanted to be close to the beach. I'd never been to California before.
Wow. And did you know anybody there, or was this totally like, I'm packing my car and I'm moving to California?
Actually, that's pretty much what happened. And my family was not really happy because at the time I was barely 20 years old. And I had bought a brand new black Monte Carlo with red interior.
Nice.
And I packed up my U-Haul and with, what belongings and furniture I had and my Siamese cat, Louise. And I drove out of the driveway. I remember, saying goodbye to all my family and they were like, oh my goodness, what is she doing? So I drove cross country. It took me 5 days because I stopped in different cities and such, but I came to California. I had never been here. The place that I was going to work, they had arranged for a place for me to live. It was with one of the other salespeople, and actually we're still good friends today. She lives in Boston and we still keep in touch. So she took me in and went to work at that station. And as you know, in the radio business, especially back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of uncertainty, and that particular station went bankrupt.
Oh, no.
So here I was living in California. This is what I want to do. I want to work in the radio business. So I went to work for a little station in Thousand Oaks, which wasn't too terribly far away. And that's where I met my husband.
Oh, wow. So now let's fast forward to you come out here and you decide, let's move to 29 Palms. Did you have kids yet at that point or not?
No, did not have kids. Like I said,
okay.
We had been married for 3 months, and where we were working in Thousand Oaks, the ownership and management were extremely religious. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
So we kept our dating on the down low. Remember, this is 1979 we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And when they did find out that we were living together,
fraternizing.
Yes, we were fraternizing. We were already engaged. We had already picked a date and all of that when we were getting married. But they let me go because they said they had a non-frat policy and they couldn't have one of their salespeople dating one of their DJs. And I was like, well, we're not just dating, we're getting married. But
wow,
things were a little different back then. And being in this field back in the 70s and early 80s, and yourself, it was a lot different for women.
Yeah.
And we were definitely discriminated against. I was the person who was making them money, but I was the one let go because I was the woman. Yeah. I mean, that's how it felt at the time anyway. Sure. So we got married. I didn't have a job at the time because I had been laid off or fired, whichever you want to call it. And that was when this same consultant called and said, I know of a company in Joshua Tree. And I was like, whatever, let's go to Joshua Tree. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it is, but yeah. And that was definitely a wake-up call.
Yeah. I mean, you're coming from like the California coast and you come out here. What was some of your first impressions as you were, I mean, a lot of people that I've talked to on this program have talked about what their impressions were as they were driving out and seeing the landscape. And so do you remember anything about that stood out for you?
Absolutely. I remember driving up, they called it the grade. They still call it the grade, the bane of our existence here in the Morongo
Right.
Basin.
One way in, one way out.
Yes, but I do remember driving up the grade and seeing the Joshua trees and being just like, wow, this is like alien. What is this place? I remember how barren I thought it was. And when it came to the actual towns, we're talking 1979,
Right.
there was nothing in Yucca Valley, nothing in Joshua Tree. Believe it or not, 29 Palms was the center of all of the commerce and the retail up here. So we moved to 29 Palms when we decided to take the job. We moved here in July of 1979, the absolute worst time to move to the desert, in my opinion. And after about 3 months, I didn't want to live here anymore. I hated it. That was my first impression. We had pretty much committed to staying at least a year to help get the sales staff started at this other radio station. So that's how we started out. And it took, I would say it probably took 6 months to a year before the desert really grew on me and I decided that I liked it.
So tell me about how Kcdz came to be.
So I'd been working at KDHI in Queen Radio for about 10 years. My husband actually had started an advertising agency after about 3 years of being there. And he came up with this idea. We saw that there was the FCC and the way licenses for radio stations are allocated has totally changed. This could never happen today. Nowadays, unfortunately, it's about whoever has the most money.
Right. Well, and consolidation during that
Right.
time. Yeah.
But back in 1987, there was only one radio station here, and that was the one that we were working at. And somebody had done what they call forced an allocation. So they said that the area was underserved and needed another radio station. Well, when my husband found that out, he said, we got to do it. And I'm, oh my gosh, I was like in my late, I don't want to do this, but he pushed forward and found a partner. And we applied for the license. And back in the day, back then, it was based on who received the license. It was based on several things, including, were you local? Were you going to actually run and operate the station? So that was a big part. And again, female. So we were 50-50 partners. That did sway some weight. And so we put our hat in the ring. There were 6 applicants. And we started in 1987. And we actually, the license at the 88, we ended up winning the license. So we won the station in January of 1989, July of 1989. So that's how we got where we are today.
Wow. Did you spend any time going into the park when you first came up here? The monument at that point, right?
Yeah, it was called the Monument then. And it kind of wasn't as big a deal as it is now. I hate to say it wasn't a big deal because it's always been beautiful, but we would go up there occasionally and have picnics and things like that. But it wasn't a main focus of what we did up here. I do have one really funny story about when we first came out to interview for the job. I don't know if a lot of your listeners are probably not old enough to remember this, but in 1979, there was a thing called gas rationing. Do you remember, Dawn? Gas rationing?
Yeah, I remember being in lines, in the car, in the family car, yeah.
And in California, if you had an odd license plate, you went on certain days. If you had an even license plate, you went on certain days, the 6 days of the week, right? And then on Sunday, it was open to anybody, but only if you could find a gas station open. So we were here in Joshua Tree on a Sunday interviewing for the job. And there were no gas stations open in this area. So we were like, okay, well, let's just drive a little bit further and we'll see what we can find. And so we kept driving down the 10 through all these different cities. And we were like, okay, we're about to run out of gas. So we ended up in West Covina at some I call it no-tell motel. It was the 99 motel. And it was definitely an interesting, I think it was like $49 or something for the night. And we had to stay there for the night because we had no gas and there was no place to buy gas. And that was the last time we ever let that happen to us.
I bet. Yeah, that only has to happen to you once and you're freaking out. You're like, I'm never doing it. Every time it's a half a tank, I'm filling up.
But I mean, we lived in Thousand Oaks. And so we couldn't get from Thousand Oaks to Joshua Tree and then back again on one tank of gas. And we didn't even factor in, there might not be any gas stations out in that neck of the woods open on a Sunday.
Right. Yeah, because as rural, you would have had no idea that it was as rural as it was.
I did not know.
So you come here as a young couple, and was the hospital here up and running at that time? Where did you have your kid?
Okay, so I had my daughter in 1981. And yes, the hospital was up and running then. There's been a hospital here since I think the 60s, but there was no maternity whatsoever. Oh. So I had my daughter and my son both at Desert Regional. And I remember that being a little scary because it was an hour's drive. I was very, very lucky and I had tendencies and very easy deliveries within 3 hours for the first and 2 hours for the second. So I made it to the hospital in time. But yeah, that was an interesting time when there was no place to have babies up here.
So when you moved here to 29 Palms, you also didn't know anybody. How did you start to find your people, if you will? Yeah.
My tribe has definitely evolved over the last 40 years. One of the things that I learned really quickly in 29 Palms is being that it's a military community, I would make friends and then they would move. And I'd make another friend and then they would move. So that's one thing that has always been difficult for me about 29 Palms is that you build these wonderful relationships. And so often people, they rotate out every 2 to 3 years. And that was especially hard for my kids growing up. But I still have some people that I met 30, 40 years ago that I still keep in touch with. So, but how did I meet people? It was pretty easy. I mean, I was in a sales position. So my job was to go out and meet every business owner in town. So I quickly met people that way. And then I got involved in a lot of different charities and fundraising and things like that. And so, yeah, I never really had a hard time finding my people. And then I got involved in later years. I would say like the last 12 years or so, I got involved in theater at Theater 29. And those are my real people. That's my family.
When you're in a show, you're with people for 6-8 weeks at a clip and then through all your shows. So you're intimately involved with each other, even in the dressing room. You know what I mean?
Exactly. You spend literally 3 months together in a room that's the size of a bedroom. Exactly. And sometimes there's 10 of you, sometimes there's 35 of you. So it's very close quarters. And it's also, I think that people who are into theater and theater arts are very like-minded and open-minded and liberal. Yeah. Yeah. So I've always had a very strong connection to the arts community up here. I dabbled in photography for quite a few years too, and actually was lucky enough to have several art shows up here and one in LA. But I did find that I could only be super involved in one art at a time. And as soon as I started getting involved in the theater, that's when I stopped doing my photography because I couldn't work full time, raise children, do photography, raise an art show to put together and do theater. So, but I'm going to get back into it.
Yeah, well, I want to kind of switch gears into that because you've also been a travel consultant and a cruise coordinator.
Actually, yes, I am. I'm a Gemini. Okay. So anybody who has a friend who's a Gemini.
My mom's knows a Gemini.
This. Okay. So Geminis are never happy doing one thing, whether you believe in the astrology or not. It is my personality type. So yes, I actually own a travel agency. I own Custom Travel Service, which was started by Virginia Williams over 50 years ago, the sister of Esther Williams, the
Oh my goodness,
famous
the swimmer.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes. So the Williams family started it. Their daughters took over. Nancy Huntington, her husband's been very involved in town politics. And then a very close friend of mine bought the travel agency about 15 years ago. Oh, actually, it was longer than that. Ooh, maybe closer to 20 years ago. We became fast friends. I started doing group tours with her and group cruises. And we actually started doing group cruises over 30 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's how I kind of got the travel bug. And when my friend decided that it was time for her to retire, semi-retire, and to move out of California, that's when I bought the travel agency from her. So I actually took over in the beginning part of 2020.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So that was really fun. I had been booking travel and acting as a travel consultant and putting groups together all along. Got my cruise counselor certification from CLIA and so on and so forth. So I had been doing all of that, but I actually took ownership of the business in March of 2020. And we all know what happened in March of 2020.
Right. Oh my goodness.
So
So prior to this, when you were coordinating these groups and things like that, did you also go on the trips?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
where are some of the places that you've been? Because your office is full of photographs of places around the world, from what I remember.
We focused a lot on cruises because I happen to really enjoy cruising. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen after the pandemic. I mean, the cruise industry has changed so drastically. For instance, Carnival Cruise Lines has sold off 19 of their ships since the pandemic
Oh,
hit.
I didn't know that. Oh my goodness.
Either sold off or scrapped them. So I think the business model is going to change drastically. But I've taken groups we did a Paris group one time where I took a group of mostly women from the area here. A lot of them were widows, actually. And it was a great way for them to travel together. I'd like to do that again at some point in time. We've taken a group to Barcelona. We've taken a lot of groups to the Caribbean, Mexico. I've escorted 6 groups to Alaska. So I've been to Alaska quite a few times. It's actually my favorite place to go.
I was going to ask you, where would you go back to? So, yeah.
Yeah. When somebody says, hey, I want to go to Alaska, can you do a group to Alaska? It doesn't take a lot of arm twisting.
Yeah.
Because Alaska is some of the most beautiful, pristine country I have ever been to. And, the opportunity to see orcas in the wild and humpback whales and wolves one time. We saw a pack of wolves and moose. We had a moose jump out in front of our bus on one of our tours one time.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was a little scary. You have no idea how big they are until there's one in front of your bus.
Right. They're pretty big. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really into wildlife. I guess it might come from my roots of growing up in Minnesota because I was very involved in 4-H.
Oh,
and something that people don't usually know about me is I raised a calf all the way through to market.
Wow.
So I showed my heifer, and her name was Buttercup. So sometimes my family will tease me about Buttercup.
Aw.
I was very involved with that. And then I got the horse bug. And so I got my first horse when I was about 12 and did a lot of horse shows. My family took me around in the summertime because back there it's usually only in the summertime.
Right.
We went to a lot of horse shows and I competed a lot. And I was actually the Cannon Falls Ridge Riders Saddle Club queen.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I was definitely always an animal person. So I'm really, really enamored of our desert wildlife. And, a lot of people say, oh, there's nothing here, it's just bugs and snakes. And it's like, that's so not true. We are fortunate enough to live on the border of the national park. And we have a huge koi pond in our backyard. And I've noticed, and this has really been, I don't know if it has anything to do with the pandemic or not. I really don't. But there is more wildlife this past year than there have been in the 20 years we've lived in our house.
Wow.
Where we built. We have a resident bobcat. We have lots of coyotes, of course, quail. We have a hawk that lives in our backyard.
Okay.
We've had an owl that unfortunately ate a lot of our fish, our koi.
He thought he found a buffet.
Yeah. We have cameras all over the exterior of the house. We have security cameras. So we'll get an alert and we'll look out and it's like, oh, there's the bobcat, or there's the owl, or, so we have 750,000 acres as our backyard.
Exactly. What was your reaction to all that wildlife when you first came here?
When I first came here, the first time I saw a coyote, I was excited because I always have loved dogs. I mean, I know they're not dogs, but I was like, ooh, a coyote,
Right. Were there any dangers or experiences that when you came out, you weren't expecting when you came out from the coast?
Fortunately, I never really ran into any snakes. I've never really had any bad experiences with snakes. I would say that I saw more snakes growing up in Minnesota than I have out here. I know they're here, but I haven't had any negative experiences. The only really negative experience I've had is with scorpions.
Yeah.
And I absolutely hate scorpions. The sight of a scorpion just will send me into a tear. I'll jump up on a chair,
I've probably had 3 in my apartment since I moved here.
Yeah, we get about 1 per year in the house. Mm-hmm. And so I've now for the first time actually hired a pest control company. Oh. Yeah, because I have grandbabies and I don't want to ever them to find, and I have cats, and cats think it's really fun to play with the scorpion. Right. Even though they are rather large, they're like 20-pound cats. I've seen what can happen when a cat does get stung by a scorpion. So I remember one time going out. The first house we lived in here, the laundry room was outside on the patio. Quite common, I think, in some of the older desert homes here. And to do the wash. So I was pulling the wash out of the washing machine to put in the dryer. And I was like, oh, what is this? And it was a scorpion. A scorpion had made it all the way through the wash cycle. It had probably crawled in there before I did the wash. Oh my, I think I threw all the laundry in the air and I screamed and I was like, help, help, help.
Oh my gosh, that's scary. I had one in here very recently, probably in the last 6 months, and I put a glass lid over it, but I was Zooming with my brother and he was getting a real charge out of it. He's like, put the computer down so I can see it and all this. And then I moved it to the door so that I could sweep it into the desert. And he goes, oh, you're going to hurt it. I'm like, oh no, I am not hurting. I said, it's got like an armor on it. Don't worry about the scorpion. But it was a good size. It was probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 inches. So I know they're bigger than that, but that was a pretty big one for in here. Yeah. And it blended with my rug, which was bad.
Well, luckily I have terracotta tile all throughout my house. So you can usually see the scorpion pretty easily.
Right. Right.
Or if I see the cats chasing something, then I'm always a little bit suspect.
Right. Suspicious.
They've caught a couple this year so far.
I bet.
So,
oh my gosh.
And we've had a lot of tarantulas. I think we have maybe a migratory path around our house, but I have never been afraid of spiders or tarantulas. So I have one that's 3 and we call her our wild child. She's not afraid of anything. And we found one in the backyard a couple of weeks ago, a baby one. Mm-hmm. And so the next time she came over, she was walking all around the backyard looking. Where is the tarantula? She took chalk and drew a picture of it on the, on the tile. And
Did both of your kids stay here in the desert?
My son actually did. My son works for me. He's my operations manager for C1077, and he's also on air. My daughter went to LA. She went to school at USC, and she thought she was going to become a journalist. She started out in the Annenberg School there and thought, oh, I'm going to be a journalist just like my dad. And she realized after about a year that she wanted to go more on the marketing side. And so she actually has worked mostly in the studios. She's worked for Paramount, Warner Brothers, and now she's at Disney Media Entertainment Distribution. So it's like the side that works with, I can't describe it.
Oh, okay. Complicated.
Kind of is.
Yeah, it can be. The studio system is complicated.
And it's gotten even more complicated.
Yes, for sure. When you moved here, when did your family come and visit you, and what was their reaction to where you were living?
I'm trying to remember, actually. My mom and dad didn't come to visit until I'd been here for a couple of years. I had gone back there to visit them,
Mm-hmm.
but they had not come out here until my daughter was actually about 6 weeks old. Once they had a grandchild, then they came out to the desert. And I mean, I think they liked it.
Mm-hmm.
They unfortunately didn't get to come out very often because they both died very young. So my mother came out a few more times and she really liked it. She thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But and my sister, she has now moved in with me.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, she is a Wisconsin, lived in Wisconsin for the last 35 years. And unfortunately, her husband passed away a couple of years ago. So she came out here to stay with me. And now she is permanently living with me. And I think she likes not having snow.
Yeah. It's not hard to get used to. Although this weekend, this Sunday, we had some snow, but it's the perfect kind. It's kind of up in the mountains, or it's maybe 2 inches tops, if that. And then it's gone in a couple of days. So for us who have grown up with snow, it's a nice nostalgia break, and then it's gone.
And I knew better than to say, when there's snow, do you want to drive up to see it? It's like, I've seen snow plenty.
Too soon.
I do not want to see any more snow.
Oh my gosh. Well, I have had a great time having a conversation with you about your desert life and your pre-desert life. Before I let you go, though, I'm going to pick some questions out of the magic jar. These questions are exclusive content for Patreon supporters of the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. So if you're listening and you want to hear Cindy's answers to these questions, I encourage you to go out to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and sign up to be a patron of the podcast. And the questions that I will be asking Cindy are, is this the life you thought you'd have when you were a teenager? What was the first music you ever bought? How has being in the desert changed you? And 2 pieces of advice for someone moving to the desert. So again, if you want to hear Cindy's answers to those questions, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and become a patron of the podcast. Cindy Daigneault, thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dawn. I've had fun too.
Cool.
So in addition to those couple of tech issues due to the wind and Zoom, while I was talking with Cindy, you may also notice that the intro and outro sound different from the main interview, and that's because you're only hearing it in one ear, and I'm not doing that on purpose to drive you crazy. Actually, someone who fixed my computer is driving me crazy and did me the favor of upgrading my operating system in the process of helping me with some other things. And now I'm having some software issues with things being compatible with the new operating system. So I hope you'll bear with me. If you know someone who might like this episode, would you take a second to share it with them today? And you can subscribe so you never miss an episode. It's free on whatever podcast platform you're listening from, or on SoundCloud or YouTube. Thanks so much for listening.